Welcome to another project showcase. This week, we're thinking about play, or what is sometimes also called experimentation in digital humanities. You've practiced by using Twine, a tool used for branch logic games, but you've used it in a playful way, an experimental way, as you've made non-linear essays. And what we're going to do in this video is look at 3 different projects that let us see different ways of applying the idea of play to DH. First, I would like to look at a way that other people have used Twine in education, because remember, digital pedagogy and critical digital pedagogy is part of DH2. And so what you're seeing now is the Center for the History of Video Games and Critical Play. And at this center, we have a professor who assigned a Twine game, much like you have in this class. What's different, though, is we're using Twine to make nonlinear essays, using to play with the past work to make something new. And what this professor has done has used Twine to have students make historical games so they can see how agency works. Let's take a look at one. Let's start with an example that will resonate with what you're doing this week. So you're using Twine to make a nonlinear essay. And what it's often used for is branch logic games. And what you're looking at now is an example from the Center for the History of Video Games and Critical Play of a history assignment where students picked a historical period that they were studying and turned it into a game so they can examine agency. Let's take a look at one. So here's one that's chosen to focus on the American Revolution. We see it's December 9th, 1773. And let's see what happens next. I can go through and see who I am. I live in Boston. There's going to be Tea Party rumors. Oh, now I get some choices. You know what? I'm gonna go dump some tea. There we go. We're dumping the British tea. And so this is maybe how this platform was originally designed for. It was designed for you to make game experience for others. But that's not always how play is used. We can think about play in digital humanities in the sense of critical digital humanities will examine games. It'll apply game theory and play theory. But it's also a method where we think about how can I play? How can I experiment with methods and texts and data? So let's look at an example, still thinking about Twine. The inspiration, this is something that you have access to, and it relates to your readings for this week. The inspiration for this way of looking at Twine was Dr. Hegestad's use of Twine. He used it in his research, in his preparation for comprehensive exams. When you go on to grad school, you have these exams you pass to show you can teach in that area. So he used this as sort of a mind map software for it. And then he presented on it at the Digital Humanities Summer Institute, which is where lots of DHers gather and form community and learn from each other. He presented on that, saying that this can be a way to do nonlinear essays. And so where before you were seeing a game with a few choices and some citations, it's interesting. And in Dr. Hagestad's, you're seeing ways that we can go through as a user and have it where we decide where to go. Maybe I want to learn more about Donna Haraway. I can learn more about that. And I'm thinking, what is a sideboard? I'm thinking, oh, what did I miss? And so there are ways that you can play with this where he's experimenting and seeing how does all of my thought and all of my research and all my resources, how do they map together? And allowing the user to play with it as well. And so that's another way that play can come in. It can be a way of like we're looking at using play to discover something about our area. So maybe by making this game, these students discover something about agency. We play for how we develop products and platforms for others to use. We play with the platform. Maybe we experiment and play and use it in a different way to generate insights. And we'll be thinking about that throughout this term, thinking about how can I use a tool to research, to examine, to analyze on one end, or how can I use a tool to present that to others. Those are both very important aspects of DH because we value openness in this field. You can't just hold on to it or just talk to other researchers. You have to share it broadly. But let's move on now to maybe almost the trope namer of experimentation in DH, the way that you can have an open platform that you can play around with and do experiments. A lot of this thinking of tools providing ways for us to experiment and play with text or data or ways of thinking is this tool called Voyant. And it was made by the late Stefan Sinclair and Jeffrey Rockwell. And Jeffrey Rockwell is still working on it. You heard from them in that video from the very first week. And next week, you're going to start the unit on textual analysis where we look in more detail at this. But I want to show it to you as an idea of DH as play through its method. Remember, play and experimentation, they're kind of used interchangeably in this. And the way this works is because it's thought of as play because you get the text in there and then you can decide, well, how am I going to examine the text? What is jumping out at me? This is not to let go of or degrade systematic research. That's still very important. But there are times where you need to play with it and examine it in a way that's low stakes. This can allow for that, where you can say, okay, what happens if I look at these different links? What happens if I remove different words? That's called adding stop words, because see how it says in there? I don't really want to let you know what it said. Of course, Aragorn and Gandalf and Sam are saying things. It's a novel. But let's take that in a different way. So there's play in the sense of I don't really know what I'm going to do yet. I want to explore. I want to have insights that emerge through interacting with the tool. But that's not all it means. Remember, I said this isn't against systematic forms of study. It can also be a form of experimentation, an idea of bringing experimental method into humanities research. So with something like Voyant, what I can do is I can say, what will happen? What will I find? How will the text be seen if I remove certain words? Those are called stop words. Another experiment that's going on now is thinking about what happens if I only look at the stop word. So they can be experimental. You can say, have a hypothesis. What will I discover about the text if I do these things? What will emerge if I use this method? So experimentation means that as well. But let's think about another way to think about this. So we've had where, how can I use the tools to come across different ideas? How can I play with the way the tool is supposed to be used? And how can I experiment? But we can also think about this as, how can I do maybe public-facing work that looks at popular culture and examines games and gaming and play? And so I want to tell you about Dr. Friedman. This is her right here. She does a lot of work on this. She's originally an 18th century scholar, so she's in English studies and literature. But what she's been doing is focusing on role-playing games and gaming and play, and especially focusing on actual plays. She researches Critical Role, and she's actually on Twitter. I know many of you may not be using Twitter, but if you find her on Twitter, she does a lot of work of talking about Critical Role on there. And part of the work she does as she's working in her research and teaching is she's working on making a database of all actual plays. So an actual play is like a video or a podcast where someone's playing a role-playing game and they're doing it live, and maybe they're cutting, maybe they're not. So Critical Role is a kind of a foundational one of that, Dimension 20, things like that. And so that's the way where she starts off. She's researching the century before me. I researched the 19th century, starts off in literature and moved on to sort of thinking about how is gaming coming out in her own area, and then thinking about how is gaming and play important today. So play is something where it's not just that we use as a method, but it's also that we can look directly at it and come to insights. That's part of critical DHO as well. And part of what brings her really into this is the way that another avenue's broad idea of digital humanities is that it's also how you do things publicly, how you share, how you use social media, how you use, she has her website here. And it also means part of that, it's called community engagement or public scholarship. Part of what we're seeing with that is it's not necessarily like a scholar like Dr. Friedman sharing their ideas, and that's part of it too. It's also about how do communities come together with the digital tools available to become knowledge producers and share insights. And that's really on display with this idea of Series Seeker. This is an actual play database that has a 450 plus role-playing games, podcasts, and streams. And this is different from the one I mentioned that Dr. Friedman does. She has a form that she sends out with her students so that she can get information on actual plays for her own research, because she's looking at things that are happening across actual places, kind of like what's happening in our zeitgeist, things like that. This is by a different group, by a community, but it's a fantastic example of a database, of an open and accessible database. So we have the idea of open, we have the idea of collaboration. They're asking for you to submit. And that's part of the idea too. Remember, we were thinking about how digital humanities a few weeks ago, how digital humanities tries to meld the values of academic subcultures and the values of the internet subcultures. And so the academic subcultures can sometimes go too far, frankly, into gatekeepers and cutting people out. And so digital humanities works against that and would value something like this, where it's people working together to bring information. And the way they let you do this filtered search, it's really a fantastic example of structured data, which we'll get into a little bit later. So those are different ways to think about play. We'll go into more of these as we go on, because we'll have Voyant tools will be an actual assignment for you later on. But as you're going through this class, think about what is interesting for you. What are you fascinated by? What kind of work would you want to do? And that's why we have these project showcases, because if you're thinking, wow, I would like to do something like Dr. Friedman does, then we can find a tool for that. Or I really like what this is doing, then maybe we can find a way for you to work with the information they have here. So working with play this week, and we're going to textual analysis next, but we're not going to stop at play and experimentation, because these are essential ideas in digital humanities.